Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Foreign Office's presentation at Civil Service Live today. We will be talking about the political response to the Arab Spring, so I hope you're in the right room for that. And I'm very sorry too that you've had such a long wait. I understand that the topic of welfare in the 21st century is a very absorbing one, so much so that it went on 20 minutes longer than it should. So apologies for that. And I should kick off by a further apology, because as the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed, I am not Dr. Christian Turner. I am, in fact, Dr. Leanne Saunders. And I am, in fact, one of the manifestations of the Arab Spring at the Foreign Office, because the work of the Middle East and North Africa Directorate has grown so extensively during the first 6 months of this year that we now have 2 directors covering it. And as Christian has unfortunately been unexpectedly pulled away to travel overseas with the Foreign Secretary today, I have stepped in to take his place. I think, first of all, it's worth talking a little bit about what happened in the Arab Spring. What do we actually mean by it? And clearly, the eruption of protest movements across the Middle East is what the Foreign Secretary has categorized as the most important development of the early 21st century and possibly of the whole century. And we talk about the Arab Spring as if it is one thing, whereas, of course, it is a series of different things happening in a wide area known as the Middle East and North Africa. It is essentially a series of protest movements which then develop in one way or another to bring about change, or to try to bring about change within the society and within the governments that those countries are situated in. We might call them revolutions, and if they are revolutions, they are Arab revolutions. They are not our revolutions. They are not things that we have created here in the UK or in the West. They are events that have been developed from drivers, which we will look at in a moment or two, within the region itself. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because I think there are those who have sought to suggest that in some way the Arab Spring is actually something that has been driven by those of us who aspire to domestic, democratic norms in the West. And in fact, what we would argue is that those are universal values and universal norms, and therefore it is not surprising that we are seeing aspirations to achieve those norms in the Arab Spring. And what the Arab Spring does is show that demands for political and economic freedom will spread in different kinetic, dynamic ways, depending on the local circumstances, and driven in some cases by the technology at people's disposal. These have been called the Facebook revolutions. But they will take root because they go to the heart of the fundamental values that we all share. And as I hope to show in the course of this presentation, the Arab Spring matters to the prosperity and security of the UK. It's not something that's happening a long way away and which we can take an interest in as we see the pictures on our television screens, but not feel that there is a ripple back into the domestic sphere. These are very serious revolts with very serious sort of situations at their heart. And of course, what they can do in certain circumstances is mean that people flee from those revolutions and wish to move towards the UK. And the Middle East, of course, is on our doorstep. But more importantly than that, they offer opportunities too for our prosperity, because while they are cataclysmic as they happen, and while they currently are providing a backdrop of more instability even than normal for a region that is prone to instability, ultimately, if they succeed, they could mean greater prosperity not just for the region, but also for the UK and for our partners and allies around the world. So in the presentation today, I'm going to take you through a flavour of the Arab Spring, both in terms of what happened, and I will spend just a few moments on that. Then I'm going to look at what it meant for the Foreign Office as an organisation, because I think as civil service organisations, it teaches us some important lessons about the way that we react to the unexpected. I'm going to look at that from the perspective of what happened in London. And then we're very lucky today to have my colleague Hannah Ramsey from our embassy in Cairo to be able to talk about how it felt at the front line just around the corner from Tahrir Square when all those amazing events that you will be very familiar with were going on. And then finally, a short reflection on what it means for those of us in leadership positions and how it relates to strategic leadership within the public sector. So in terms of the MENA region, as I said, a large area, and what we saw happening over the course of a very rapid time from the self-immolation that happened in a Tunisian village by somebody who felt so desperate that the only way that they could express what they felt was to set fire to themselves, spread around the region, across the region in different ways. It moved, as we know, from Tunisia to Egypt, and then at the same time as those two crises were happening, there were protest movements across the region in the Gulf, even in Iran, and of course in Libya. And why did those protest movements erupt? Well, I talked earlier about the drivers of discontent, and this slide shows the work that the Foreign Office had done for a year before the actual events of Tunisia and Egypt catapulted the Arab Spring onto the screens of our televisions. In the Foreign Office, we had been worried for some time about the low-level sense that something in the region was going to go wrong in a very volatile way. And the Foreign Secretary has characterized this as a volcanic eruption. You can monitor the seismic activity below the surface, and you can be sure that somewhere or other that seismic activity is going to lead to a blow. But you don't know where it's going to happen, you don't know how it's going to happen, how powerful it will be, and you certainly don't know where it will happen. And as we all know from the subsequent earthquake and tsunami within the Japanese area, there can be a very wide ripple effect from seismic activity. And that is very much how it felt in the Arab Spring and how it continues to feel. Because while some might characterize what is happening in the region now in Syria, for example, where we continue to see protests and we continue to see repression by the government there, but also in places like Yemen that are not on the television screens so much, but where, again, there are significant issues. And of course, in Libya, we see those ripples, those aftershocks, or even a new round of new shocks continuing to happen. And the reason for those shocks are the drivers that you see on your screen. A whole range of concerns that people had about government accountability, about corruption, about the need for a public voice and a political space for those who felt disenfranchised. And it is no surprise when you look through those drivers that education for employment and rule of law and those sorts of things which we consider a daily part of our life within the public sector are the sort of things that actually drive people to revolt. And clearly, the economic downturn, the global economic downturn over the last few years has eventually meant that things have reached boiling point in the Middle East. And one of the reasons for that, and one of the reasons why we call them the Facebook revolutions, is that the percentage of young people in the Middle East is huge. There are, in many places, 2/3 of the population are under 25. And so that means that you have a group of people that feel, and in many cases are dispossessed, In many Arab countries, even those with a vote, there is not a vote until you are 30 years old. So even in the countries which have voting systems, the young people, and by that I mean sort of people up to their sort of 20s and 30s, felt that there was no hope, that there were no jobs, that there were no prospects. And sooner or later, unless the governments responded to those underlying causes, there was going to be a major explosion, and that is what we eventually saw. So I suppose bringing it back down to the Foreign Office and what it meant for us as an organisation, well, clearly the speed with which things happened and the uncertainty about how they were going to carry on developing and how they did develop were major factors in the way that we responded to them. I think it's easy with hindsight to say, well, you should have seen it coming, but I think we can be reasonably relaxed within the civil service because, okay, we didn't see it coming, but at least we had been doing some work on the underlying causes that were likely to make it come. And actually, no commentators had really spotted when and where this was going to happen and quite how widespread it was going to go. So I think some people might criticise the Foreign Office for starting slowly, but actually I think we were in a good position, and Hannah will speak in a little while about the work that she did in the embassy, because actually our embassies, as our beacons of knowledge and understanding within the region, had been warning, and Cairo in particular had been warning for several months that something was likely to happen, but it simply wasn't clear enough how and when and what the manifestation of that would be. But when the crises kicked off, of course, the initial sense of a crisis in the Foreign Office is often felt by the consular response. And there is a session tomorrow that will deal specifically with the consular aspects of the way that we responded to the Arab Spring and a host of other crises that have hit us this year. But I think in political terms, what it meant was ramping up very rapidly from a very small core team. And in the Foreign Office, we often have only one or possibly even not a single person dealing with the smaller countries in our region. And even where there is a larger country, for example, Iran, where we have a larger team, it is still only, sort of 5 or 6 people at the maximum. So actually, with several crises happening simultaneously, we needed to ramp up the organisation very quickly. We're fortunate enough to have a crisis centre which we can base the work around, but even then, we were used to dealing, by and large, with consular and political crises that lasted a matter of days or weeks, and not a matter of months with multiple crises happening at the same time. So we had to respond by pulling in people from other directorates. And obviously, because of the way the Foreign Office works, that meant that there were people in other directorates doing completely different work currently who had experience either of a Middle East posting or had worked on Middle East issues in London. So we were able to draw together that experience and that expertise. But we had to do so quickly, and we had to do so with teams that weren't used to working together, and that was quite a challenge in itself. And of course, we had to staff it on a 24/7 basis, because the political cycle these days works to a 24/7 cycle. It's not like ministers go home at 8 o'clock in the evening and don't want anything until 10 o'clock the next morning. Would that were the case sometimes. So we drew staff in and we formulated teams, and that was very essential, because one of the key characteristics of the way that the government responded to the Arab Spring and continues to respond to the Arab Spring is the activation of the National Security Council, which of course, when these manifestations of the Arab Spring started at the turn of the year, was really only 6 months old, and the Foreign Office was still really beginning to find its way, its path of dealing with the National Security Council. And the National Security Council had been meeting on a fortnightly basis to deal with large-scale strategic issues, but looking at the medium term and looking at developments over a sustained period of time. rather than being required to look in quick succession at a number of crunchy strategic issues with which ministers were not necessarily familiar with because they had not been at the top of the foreign policy agenda previously, and had to make strategic decisions about what was going to happen, as well as some of the tactical decisions that needed to be made. The NSC created a huge amount of work because it really is an action-oriented organisation and coordination body. And I think that was, to some extent, quite a shock for the Foreign Office, because the Foreign Office as a policy organisation is well used to dealing with analysis, of developing analysis, and particularly of developing analysis for the medium term in very polished papers. But when you have an NSC meeting every single day and discussing 3 or 4 different countries in some cases each time it meets, then clearly ministers do not want a carefully polished analysis, and actually it's not appropriate for the circumstances. So we had to shift our method of working, and I think it's been a very healthy way of making us recognise that actually we need to do the analysis, and we need to do the analysis underneath. I think in previous times we might have called it an evidence-based approach. But actually, what we need to do is to turn that into actions and outcomes very quickly. And I think what it has helped the Foreign Office do, and the other government departments, some of which may be represented here, who have also been involved in the NSC process for the Arab Spring, to respond much more effectively and to think through the issues on our feet, rather than necessarily with the luxury of a great deal of time to polish and craft and hone. And I think there is a lesson here in the austerity that we face, because actually sometimes I think we can gold plate things too much. And one thing we have learnt in our interaction with ministers across the Arab Spring is that there are times when something is good enough and does meet the remit, even if it isn't as gold-plated as we might want it to be, with the luxury of planning and time to think about things in advance. Of course, we had to deal with the pressure of the 24/7 media cycle, and I think one of the other great lessons of this is that, I mean, the media cycle is the sea in which we swim. It's not something we can change, and it's often not something that we can affect or influence, and in some cases, nor should we seek to do so. In particular, in the Arab Spring, of course, Al Jazeera and the Arab media and the English-speaking face of the Arab media have really come into play. And that means that we have had to respond to events that are being portrayed on the media, whereas our background analysis may be telling us something different. And so again, from a strategic point of view, it is about getting the balance right between needing to be seen to be responding to the things that people are seeing are happening on their screens and hearing about or seeing tweets about, but also to keep that strategic judgment at the heart of what we are doing and to make sure that we are clear about our goals and objectives in what we are trying to achieve. And just as a sort of indication of how difficult that can be, and certainly was in the heart and heat of the first phases of the Arab Spring, there was a jump in our organisational email traffic from 2 million through to 5 million emails passing through the Foreign Office system. That's internal email, that's not sort of the external public-facing aspect of the consular side of things. So that's the internal emailing, trying to manage and trying to share and pass information. And that's had a huge slowing down effect on our IT infrastructure. Of course, we depend on our ability to reach into our posts and to get analysis, not just from the countries on the ground, but also the multilateral organisations like the UN in New York and the EU in Brussels, to be able to formulate our advice for ministers. And so to have a system which was slowing down physically and visibly on us was very tough to deal with. But we were able to get through it, and again, interestingly, we were able to find some technological fixes, which meant that we could share information much more quickly amongst one another. And there is also the difficulty, and I think this is a really sort of new thing, certainly for the Foreign Office, in terms of the fact that we now have kind of widespread access to BlackBerries and sort of handheld tools, which is great because it means that people are always in contact and are always able to make decisions, and ministers are always able to make decisions, whether they are actually physically near their red boxes or not. But actually what it also means is that you have to change your style of writing and change your style of communicating to get across the same points that you might otherwise do traditionally in a long Word document. And also you need to make sure that you're putting the key points up front, because as those of you who have BlackBerries know, once you get to the more plus, if you're in a rush, waiting for that to sort of load really actually kind of takes away the point. So in a way, it became a question of finding almost a haiku formulation to be able to set out decisions, while at the same time making sure that ministers had the broader strategic perspective at the back of their heads to be taking those decisions in. I'm going to hand over at this point to Hannah, who's going to tell you a little bit about how it felt, as I said earlier, at the front line, and what it means to be one of our locally engaged staff within the Foreign Office, not a diplomat based in the UK, travelling and living to a post for a number of years and then returning to jobs in London, but actually employed by the embassy and permanently stationed there in her home country. Hannah.
Thank you, Lian. Good afternoon. Well, it's been 5 months now since the political upheaval in Egypt. As Lian said, there were all the underlying causes for something to happen, but did we expect it to happen? Not really. We knew that there were going to be demonstrations on the 25th of January, and they were probably going to be bigger than usual. But no one expected it to result in overthrowing the regime, and in just 18 days. I mean, as an Egyptian, I would never have dreamt of this. So as the events unfolded, the pressure on the team in Cairo was mounting, the demands from London was increasing, the embassy had to deal with the increase in political work, as well as taking care of British citizens, making sure they are safe and that the evacuation is run smoothly. But having said that, the embassy in Cairo is very close to Tahrir Square, so it's the center of activity. So security was a major concern. So for our safety, the embassy, our senior management advised us, the local staff team of political section, to work from home. But though this might have felt more comfortable, we had a number of challenges to deal with. For one, our only political officer was stranded in London during the crisis. So we, as the rest of the team, the media officer, the projects, myself as an economist, we had to use our knowledge of our country to be able to deliver the work required and meet the deadlines. We had to face other challenges. So for example, we stayed for days with no internet or mobile services. And so access to information itself was difficult. Access to our contacts was difficult. We had to think outside the box. We had to find ways to get the information required to deliver the reporting and meet deadlines and ministers when they want something, they really want it quickly. We also had other challenges to deal with, and one of it was to coordinate the work amongst us. Because one fact that is often overlooked is that for local staff, it was not just the workload that we had to deal with. We also had families and children to take care of. So we had to cover for each other when one was unavailable. We also had the psychological pressure to deal with. It was the worry about tomorrow, the fear of the unknown. It was children asking questions that we did not have an answer to. It was often sometimes very difficult to go to bed at night, knowing that a husband or a son is joining a family watch group who are basically protecting our houses and our properties from looters at night. But we had to deal with this, and we had to deal with the political work at the same time. But I believe that we learn lessons from every crisis, and so I would like to leave with you a few thoughts. And the most importantly is to be prepared. You never know when a crisis will hit or what sort of challenges it will bring with it. So the first thing to me is be prepared. Know the skills and talents of the different members of your team. Invest in their training so that when and if a crisis hits, you are able to make best use of their different skills, and they are able to easily cope with the work and deal with the situation. Another important one is communication. Don't lose touch with your staff. There is nothing worse than members of the team who are not involved directly in dealing with the crisis, just sitting at home, not knowing what is going on, and feeling completely ignored. Another important lesson for me was not to underestimate the pressures that natives of a country or a community suffer during a crisis. For us, this was not a crisis that we had to deal with. It was not a task that we had to accomplish. It was our country in a crisis. It was our future and the future of our kids. And we knew very well that if things got worse, we have no safer home to go to. This was just home. So appreciate the pressure that natives of a community or country face during a crisis. As for Egypt, well, we still, as an Egyptian, I mean, we realize that we still have a long way to go, and it won't be a smooth path. It won't be an easy ride. The resurgence of violence a few days ago was just a reminder of how fragile the situation is. But I'm still hopeful. I'm still hopeful that our children and grandchildren will have a better future. Thank you.
And I think Hannah's speech really needs sort of no commentary except to say that the British government does owe a huge debt of gratitude to the locally engaged staff that we have throughout our diplomatic network. They are a huge resource that we as government officials draw on, both in times of crisis as Hannah has described, but also on an everyday basis. And it's sometimes a hidden face of the British public service that we forget at our peril, as Hannah's talk neatly demonstrates. So I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about that strategic context in terms of why we respond in the way we did and are doing. We have designed in the UK something which we call the Arab Partnership, and it's called the Arab Partnership because it does what it says on the tin. It is an Arab partnership. And I think this is quite an important but very basic point to make, which is that in the Middle East, we have traditionally carried a huge amount of baggage with us, baggage from a past that is seen by many in the region as a colonial past and imperial interference. And however far we know that we have moved from that position and that truth, it has been very hard to convince those in the region that that is the case. And so building genuine partnerships with the countries of the region is a key priority for us in the Foreign Office, but more broadly within the UK government. We had been developing before the Arab Spring hit and were therefore able to move quickly when it did to develop the practical aspects of this strategy, which is working with partners within the countries concerned, not just at the governmental level, though the governmental level is perhaps the level that as civil servants we are most comfortable and familiar with working with, but also with media and civil society. Now, this is bread and butter to all of those of you who are working in the domestic context, but it's often quite hard when we are working with other countries to get in at those levels and to have an engagement which is a trusted engagement, and building up the trust with the countries with whom we are dealing with, particularly in the sort of uncertain circumstances that Hannah is talking about, and where there are significant changes, where perhaps all of the contacts that we had developed with previous governments have changed, where people who we were seeing in an opposition context are now perhaps in a governmental context, and where others are filling that opposition or that political space. Or where there has been no political space and suddenly there are people filling it. Those are challenges to find the partnerships, to find the voice for a partnership with the Arab world. So we have set up a fund, and it is a small fund because, as we all know, we have no money. But it is a fund which is meant to be a driver for others and a driver to help demonstrate the commitment over time that we have towards bringing prosperity and stability to the Middle East. And you can see on the screen now the themes on which this fund works. And again, none of it's rocket science. You can see how they relate to the drivers that I put up earlier. But actually they are important in terms of analysing the sorts of things that actually putting emphasis on and putting support to can actually deliver both change but also stability in the longer term for the region. And we are now beginning to work with others to expand the concept of the Arab Partnership. And those of you who follow the events of the G8 will know that recently in France there was something called the Deauville Summit. At the Deauville Summit, one of the most important planks within that was a recognition that there did need, at the G8 level, to be an engagement and a partnership with the countries of the region, in particular with Egypt and Tunisia, because they are furthest along their path to transition, but also recognizing that it does not need to be regime change and a revolution which brings about partnership. To recognize too that there are those in the region who are taking what we might call an evolutionary path by changing more slowly and in an incremental way, rather than the sort of transformational change in one fell swoop that we have seen in Egypt and Tunisia. So what does this mean for us as leaders? Well, I've talked already about the focus and the need to focus down both on the words we use, the tools we use to communicate, but also to the essence of what we are trying to convey. But it's important too to be able to support our staff through that process. And Hannah's description of the pressures faced by our local staff overseas is just one manifestation of the sort of pressure that we put our staff under at a time of crisis and prolonged crisis. So actually having structures and the resources within our organisations to be able to respond with resilience and flexibly is key to being able to manage this process as far as we can. I've talked already about the need to set a strategy, to be clear about what we're trying to do. And in the case of the Arab Spring, it was about developing this sense of partnership. It was about recognising the universal values that the aspirations of the people must be met, and finding out the levers that we have at our disposal to support countries both going through the protest manifestation of the Arab Spring, but also through to transition. And we need to talk and listen more. Listening is very hard to do sometimes in a crisis. There is often a lot of noise in a room. Everybody has an opinion about what you are to do and how you are to manage something. But actually being quiet and listening to the voices of the region, but more importantly, in some cases, listening to our own internal voice about what is right for us to do. It needs space and it needs time, and those are at a premium in a crisis situation. And then the instinctive reactions. I think as leaders in a crisis, because so little is in our control, we look to control the detail. And then we look to try and do it all ourselves. And simply one of the things that we have found as leaders in the Arab Spring is there is just too much to do. There is too much to get your arms around. And actually, these are great opportunities, ironically, for many of our staff to really develop skills of their own because they have a space to be able to develop those skills. And then mastering the knowledge. Clearly, we need to be able to be clear with ministers and to be credible with ministers at senior levels of leadership. But at the same time, we need just enough detail and not too much detail, because ministers are making 101 decisions in the space of 10 minutes, and it's hard to keep them interested if the detail is there. So anticipation. I talked from the beginning about the fact that we had anticipated that something might happen, even though we didn't know what or where. And so we were in a strong policy position to respond, and we were able to respond quickly because we had anticipated that drive for change in the region. We had to be decisive. Sometimes we like to sort of think around and be consensual, but actually you have to be decisive. We had to decide whether we were standing by Mubarak or whether Mubarak had lost the legitimacy of his people. And we had to make the judgment about when and how to decide that it was time for Mubarak to go, for example. We had to be careful about extrapolating that the way things happened in a particular country were the way things were going to happen in another country. And we carry on doing that because it is important. Many people have made comparisons between Libya and what happened in Iraq, for instance. And it is important that while sometimes there are elements that are common, the need to plan for what happens after a conflict, for instance, there are many, many elements which are completely different. And it is important that we are fighting the next manifestation, and we are looking at the next manifestation of the Arab Spring and not the previous one. And we have to do things differently, and I've emphasized this throughout the talk. It is about action, it is about brevity, and it's actually about creativity too. Being forced to think differently, being forced to think about new solutions, new ways of making things happen is actually hugely energizing, but you need to have the courage to do it, and that also means taking risks. Attempting to keep a peripheral vision. In the heart of the crisis, I think we were sometimes at risk, certainly I know that I was, of kind of being inward and looking at the immediate around me without doing the listening that I talked about earlier and being able to sort of reach out more broadly into both the Whitehall community and the wider British community, and then beyond that to listen to experts both globally and in the region. Resilience is vital, and you cannot go on doing the sort of hours that have been necessary to put into the crises in the Middle East over the last 6 months, the ongoing crises, without having a proper pacing of your staff and of yourself. And there is an importance there about the role modelling to your staff. If you are working absolutely all hours and not taking rest and not eating, then your staff will think that you expect them to do the same. And clearly that is the quickest way for a team to fall over. And then lastly, this is a sort of difficult point in some ways because, again, the impetus in a crisis is always forward and always moving on to the next thing, the next decision, trying to plan ahead, trying to look, trying to anticipate. But actually, sometimes you have to stop, and you have to stop and think. And so we have to be able to make policy decisions at speed, but we also have to have the breadth and the depth of knowledge and the understanding of others' perspectives to be able to make those policies with judgment. And that means doing things slowly. So being able to find the trick of using enough speed to move yourself forward, having the agility to move forward, but creating the thinking space is absolutely vital for a strategic leader. And then finally, as I said earlier, you can't control everything. And so how do you manage that? You can't wrap it up and say, I will do all this myself. But you can ask the right questions so that others know what they are doing, and so others are clear about what you want from them. And you can ask a wide range of questions so that you can pivot wherever you need to go. And so if there is such a thing as a light bulb moment, then I think it is probably to ask the right questions rather than to search for the right answers. Thank you very much. I think we have a small amount of time time now for some questions, and we have two colleagues, Genevieve and Lynn, who have roving mics. So we can't see very well here. I'm going to rely on them to sort of spot those of you who do have questions. If I could ask you, when you're given the microphone, if you could stand up and tell us who you are and which department you represent, so that we can try and tailor the answers both to the wide audience but also to your specific needs.
Anissa Lightweller, UKTI Defence and Security Organisation. Having lived and worked in Egypt, I have a particular interest in that country. I imagine you at the Foreign Office have done some sort of horizon scanning, so I was wondering if you could comment on your thoughts on what Egypt looks like in 5 years, and then if you could comment on your personal perspective of what Egypt might look like in the future. Thank you.
I think it's a really good question, and of course what we do try to do is look forward, and actually normally I think the Foreign Office would say in general terms it's probably most comfortable at the sort of 2 to 3 year ahead rather than the 5 year ahead. I think it's particularly difficult at the moment to say what Egypt will look like in 5 years, and there are two reasons for that. One, in a way, the book is still being written. Egyptians themselves, I think, are still working out what the granularity of what they want their country to look like in 5 years will be. But I think what we can say is that in 5 years' time, what we would hope to see in Egypt is a situation where the sort of transition that we're seeing starting now with an election process has perhaps gone through some bumpy times, and I think that's the point. In 5 years' time, we might be looking at a less bumpy time, or, depending on how high the bumps are in the run-up to that, we might be looking at 5 years being a very bumpy time. But either way, I would hope it is a forward trajectory towards an ultimate situation where we have a stable democratic process with enough political space for moderate voices throughout the country, both of different political persuasions, but also of different religious persuasions to be heard. And we also have an improving economic situation. And I think we shouldn't kid ourselves that in 5 years' time that picture is going to be anywhere done. It will still be very much a work in progress. Hannah.
Well, yes, I mean 5 years is a long time. Yes, I mean we're still making it. I mean we still have very basic decisions like constitution first or parliamentary elections first. So we have very basic questions that we're still trying to answer. But what I would hope is that in 5 years' time, Egypt will be a much more democratic country. We will have free and fair elections for once. I mean, since we have not had. I mean, I can't recollect free and fair elections that we have had over the years, but economically, I would hope that Egypt would be a country where the fruits of the reform are distributed among the people, so that the poor are not as poor as they are now. It's a shame that a country that has diverse resources, a very diversified economy, has around 40% poverty. We still have a lot of work to do, but over the 5 years, I would hope that we would definitely be in a much better position than we are at the moment.
Graham Henderson, Department of Health. A little bit closer to home, but during the plenary session this morning, your Permanent Secretary said that the FCO should work much more closely with the rest of government. In putting together your teams, did you actually consider going outside the FCO to ask what type of experience, etc., people have in other parts of government? Because the reality is that there are very many civil servants, many of whom are vetted, etc., who do have quite extensive knowledge of certain trouble spots around the world. And I'm afraid the FCO has always been seen to be a little bit of a closed shop. It'd be great, actually, if some of those barriers were broken down. I appreciate that having worked in civil contingencies, you can't easily put together a team very, very quickly. But to develop panels of expertise across the whole of government would actually seem to be a very useful additional weapon in the armoury of the FCO. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very good point. I mean, I think in terms of sort of normal job recruitment, in terms of, you know, people who might come in from other departments to work with the Foreign Office on a particular geographical region, for example, where they have sectoral experience, all of our senior civil service jobs in the Foreign Office are open and advertised on interchange. So we're not a closed shop in that sense of the word, and we also have interchange at other levels of the office. In terms of the crisis management, I think in this instance, we did have people working from other government departments within the Foreign Office Crisis Centre during the heart of the crisis, in particularly from the MOD and from DFID, but also from UKBA and from the Home Office. So there were a number of people working together. And of course, coming back to the National Security Council setup, I mean, I think there, again, expertise is brought in across government. So, for example, on Libya, where we have within the Foreign Office a team looking specifically at Libyan oil issues, and that does draw in people from a broader range of government departments. So I think perhaps there are issues about maybe advertising those positions a little bit more clearly, but I don't think it's true to say that we are a closed shop, and certainly we recognise that there is a huge amount of expertise spread across the civil service, and it is about, you know, using the talent and the diversity of the civil service to work both at home and abroad.
Good afternoon, Duncan Hart from DFID. I was particularly interested by the slide on drivers of discontent. Many of these issues could equally be applied or happening in other parts of the world, notably perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa, where growth is strong in some areas of Africa, but it's not inclusive. And equally, the issues which have happened in Northern Africa could possibly spread to sub-Saharan Africa. So I suppose my first question is, what is your assessment of this? How likely are these issues to spread to other developing countries, notably in sub-Saharan Africa? And secondly, drawing on what Hannah said about the importance of being prepared, how prepared are we as the UK to react to further revolutions across the world? Thank you.
I think the first question is a really important one, and I think it's one of the reasons that the Foreign Secretary has talked about the Arab Spring as a transformational issue for the 21st century, because potentially, whether the Arab Spring goes well or badly, it could have repercussions in other areas, as you say, in particular in Africa, but also elsewhere. And of course, we know that in the Far East, for instance, there is a lot of concern that the sort of manifestations and the sort of aspirations that people in the Middle East have been expressing may be mirrored in their own countries. So in terms of its spread, is it likely? I think that's harder to tell, for the same reason that, you know, if I sort of use the volcanic analogy again, you don't quite know when and where it's going to blow. I think it's the same. Knowing whether it could transmute into a different region is quite hard to tell. And much, I think, will depend on probably the next 12 to 18 months, because there is a difficulty here, which is that you have countries that have gone through transformation, you have countries that are going through evolution, you also have countries that are going through further repression. And quite how the scorecard looks at the moment on the Arab Spring, I think the jury is still out on. And that will have an impact on whether it looks to those who are facing similar situations in different countries as whether this is the way to go, or whether there is no hope. And that is why it is in our interests, I think, to make sure that there is a positive outcome, however long it takes to achieve, to the Arab Spring. Because ultimately, in addressing some of those underlying factors in the Arab world, it both makes us more prepared and ready to tackle those situations at cause in other places. But it also means that there is a sort of momentum, and there are ways of expressing the need for change and aspirations for reform, which don't necessarily mean that in every country it needs to be a regime-changing revolution.
Hi, I'm Eric Willis. I'm not a civil servant, but I work with the civil service. From an outside perspective, the government and the Foreign Office did not come well, I'm afraid, out of how it dealt with UK interests in terms of evacuations of civilians and so on in some of the countries you've described, particularly Libya. And with respect, it's not the first time that the Foreign Office has been subject to criticism of failing to act quickly or decisively enough in these circumstances. What lessons have you learned from this for future similar instances?
Okay, well, there is a separate session yet tomorrow dealing with consular issues, but if I can just sort of take out the main contours of that. I mean, firstly, I dispute the fact that we did not deal well with the bulk of our citizens in the Arab Spring. I mean, these events moved very quickly, and we moved quickly with them. And actually, I think there are many plaudits which we have had from a large number of British citizens who were evacuated or who were helped and assisted in some way during the course of the Arab Spring to safety and to a place of safety, which demonstrate to us that while the headlines might suggest one thing, the reality is somewhat different. I think in terms of learning lessons, we have just published there is a written ministerial statement dealing with the consular evacuation review that we have just undertaken, which makes very clear that we recognise, as in any consular crisis, that there are always lessons to be learned. In terms of the number of consecutive and simultaneous crises happening in the Middle East, could we have been better prepared to have what essentially was more than a third of our workforce dealing with either the political or the consular aspects of those crises? Yes, possibly, but it had never happened in that way before. And so what we can say is that we had learned the lessons from the tsunami of 2004, and we had learned the lessons from the evacuation of 2006. There were new lessons to learn this time, and I think the consular evacuation review has gone thoroughly through those, and clearly we will now be implementing the recommendations of that review.
Dwayne Muller from Department for Transport. It's not about transport I'm going to ask you though. Thank you both for your perspectives of setting those out so clearly. I'm interested in political participation in the sense that the fund has been set up in part to look at that, and it's the ambition is obviously for open, free societies at a time when domestically the coalition government is concerned about, less electorate participation, changing society so that there's more re-engagement, big society and so on. What does that look like from your perspective in Egypt, say, for instance?
Well, I'll let Hannah talk in a moment because it is her country and she will have her own perspective on it. But I think from our point of view, what we were very conscious of is that when you have a particular type of regime where public comment has not been encouraged and where political comment has been in a very narrow, restricted sphere, it is quite hard for people to feel that they can express their points of view. And then to be able to express those points of view in a way that respect the views of others, but also accept that others will not necessarily agree with them, is quite a basic protocol, in a way, of the political space in which we inhabit and we respond within a domestic context. And so I think a lot of the work that we are doing is actually working through others, because government is not necessarily best placed to deliver this directly. And I think looking at the domestic agenda, that's in a way what the big society is also saying, that it isn't actually for government to do with or to the people. It is for the people to work with government to deliver. And that certainly in an Egyptian context is what we are doing in terms of working and helping new political parties and new political groupings both bond as political parties, whatever their purview. What their agenda is, provided it is peaceful and looking at reform, is not our business, but actually ensuring that they have the tools and the space to make their voice heard is very much in our interests. And so we are working with other third sector organisations to do that. So the funding may be ours, but actually the direction of travel and the facilitation is done by others. And I think it's important that you don't have government smothering and trying to control and direct. And I think for us, not just in Egypt but across the Middle East, that means there will be results that we may not like in certain places. And some of those results may come from potentially groups or projects or whatever that we have funded. We are very careful, clearly, within an extremist context to make sure that our money is not going where we would find it difficult for it to go. But clearly, in terms of allowing people the space to speak their own minds, we have to accept that sometimes they are A, going to say things about us that we don't like, and B, going to say things about one another that we might not necessarily agree with. Hannah? Well,
it's still very early days of democracy in Egypt, so we still have got a lot to learn. One of the first things is just to respect others' points of view and to appreciate that they do not have to always agree with what you're saying. We also have to empower the youth. If the youth were the drivers behind this revolution, then they need the help. I mean, setting up their own parties. I mean, these are people who have managed to drive the revolution, but they don't have the experience. They have never been involved in politics before. People shunned away from being involved in politics in past years because there was the security threat, for example. There was the freedom of expression, although the previous regime would have said that people have the right to express their opinion. People feared that if they speak up, they will end up in jail. So there's a lot to learn. Political parties being formed do not know the process of doing it. I mean, the embassy or the work that the embassy does will not, as Leanne said, get involved in the sort of the programs of these parties. But it's the setup, it's the procedural work that we can support them with. And they are showing interest. They are showing interest in advice. For example, being an economist, I would looking at the economy side. Most of what political parties are talking about are the politics, the change in the political sense, but the economy is completely ignored. So none of them is talking about what their political programs would be. Everyone would be saying, yes, we want more social justice, but how do you achieve this? What sort of policies are you looking at? This is something that the embassy, through think tanks, not the embassy being involved in anyone's thinking, but the embassy through think tanks, for example, can help those parties form their own agendas.
I think we probably have time for one more question, if there is one. At the front.
Thank you very much. On the Arab Partnership Fund, I wondered who manages that, and if you have any examples of where the money has actually gone to and for what use. Thank you.
Okay. It is a joint FCO and DFID fund. When it first started, it was a very small pot of money just within the Foreign Office programme budget. But as a result of the rapid manifestations of the Arab Spring, the government decided that they would expand it. So it's now jointly owned and run by DFID and the Foreign Office. And in terms of where the money goes, I mean, obviously we're at an early stage of dispersing funds, but perhaps one good example, one very kind of tangible example I can give you is that when we had our local elections here in the UK back in May, we brought over representatives from the new Egyptian Electoral Commission to see the process of how we ran our local elections. Now, some of you may have your own views about whether our local elections are a model that others should follow, but I think the practical points were things like how do you arrange ballot boxes and how do you arrange ballot stands when you are trying to be more diverse in your approach? And I think one of the things that they have taken back to Egypt, and which we are now funding with a further project, is Braille access and disability access for the elections. Because again, this is an disenfranchised part of the Egyptian population. Disability has traditionally been marginalized, and there traditionally have not been the facilities to enable others who are not able-bodied to be able to participate in any form of elections. So the fact that the Egyptians are now beginning to sort of look at how they organize themselves in that way is a very small way, but it's a very tangible way of being able to give help. And I think what we have to be careful about here is, and I know this is often a criticism levelled at the Foreign Office, is that the Foreign Office does sort of lots of things like seminars and conferences, and then it doesn't follow up. I think we are very conscious of that. But there is a balance to be reached in an Arab Spring context, because we need to give some sense initially of the support that we are giving. We need to give some hope of momentum to the peoples that have, as Hannah has described, gone through a revolutionary process, but now don't quite know, they know where they want to go, but they don't know how they're going to get there next. And so being able to find ways that we can encourage and demonstrate that we are with them and that we are willing and able to help them where they want support and give momentum to that process without dictating where those processes go is quite important. So what I say is it's not a quick win. Because obviously, giving Braille leaflets out in an election is not a win, because if the election is corrupt and not free and fair, then that is not an outcome that we would want. But it is a quick launch. And I think in the Arab Spring, our motto is very much quick launch, slow win. And I think we have to accept that the actual wins and the gains and the outcomes that we will see for democracy and for prosperity and for British interests will be in the long term, not in the short term. And that's very much how our programme is geared. Okay, well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. If there are any questions, I will hover outside afterwards for any of those whom the mic didn't reach. But thank you all for coming to listen to us today. And if you haven't already signed up and there still is room, I'd encourage you to go and see the consular presentation tomorrow. Thank you.